Hi, everyone. It's Pearl from the Business of Success. When it comes to building better, there are some essential tools that can help you not only work better, but also work smarter. For me, one of those tools for a long time has been Fathom AI. Fathom AI is a note taker like no other. It has various options, including a transcript only mode, audio only mode, video only mode, as well as offering live coaching during your sessions. I have used this so many times while I'm talking to customers, reminding me when it might be time to, take a moment or take a pause. Fathom AI is a wonderful tool that also allows you to be hands free and fully present. The most important reason that I use it in all of my meetings and my calls. So, if you are looking for a way to level up your work, gain efficiency, work smarter so that you can build better, consider Fathom AI. Check out my link to Fathom in the show notes. Hi, everyone. We are here today with someone that I have met and got to kind of engage with in a couple of fun ways, from social to also learning experiences. Thank you for being here today, Cindu. Wonderful to have you.
Thanks for having me. I feel honored.
Yeah, it's so nice. And I think from the moment I heard about you, which was through another kind of business colleague referral, I've just been really interested in it and impressed by the work that you do. And, especially wanted to bring you here because of your core kind of work, which is, inclusion, coaching and training work that I want to dig into, but also all the facets of what you bring to the community. So thank you so much for taking some time.
Yeah, it's
All
great
right.
to be connected with you. I think Terry connected us, right?
Yes, there exactly. She was highly appreciative of having worked with you on another event at CWLA. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Okay, for everyone, share a bit about you, what who you are, your journey, and all the things that you do, because you are a multi hyphenate like myself, as I call it, somebody that's working on a lot of different initiatives. So yeah, please share a little bit of your journey.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start, from when I was a little kid. Before that, my parents are immigrants from India. They came in the early 70s. So they're part of like the early wave of immigrants. And I was, raised in a predominantly white community where we were the only family of color and one of the only immigrant families. And, because of that, I experienced a lot of othering and racism and xenophobia from the age of 5. And that is really important to my story because that really shaped what I do today, right? So, grew up, went to college and went away to San Francisco. Yeah, well, my journey started with my parents. My parents immigrated here from Kerala in the early 1970s, and I was raised in the 80s. In a predominantly white suburb of Chicago. And, we were one of the only families of color, one of the only immigrant families. And in my school environment, definitely the only. And so, back then we were not as inclusive as we were today. So experienced a lot of xenophobia, a lot of racism. Actually, I feel like we're getting back to the 80s today. But, kids today are experiencing what I did in the 80s. So lots of othering, xenophobia, racism. And that really caused me to feel a deep shame for being Indian and for my otherness. And, I carry that on through my life. And it was, really graduate school that helped me to be empowered and helped me to really decolonize my mind and be proud of my difference and my Indianness, and actually put me on a path to my career. And so I am a 22-year inclusion and belonging and workplace communication practitioner, also a tenured professor of communication studies at the College of Lake County. I've been there for 18 years, and I do a lot of things, and everything that I do is really related to creating a more inclusive experience, both in our society and in the workplace.
I love that. And so, what struck me, like why I wanted you here on the Business of Success is, as we all know, in the last whatever 3-ish whatever years, I don't even know how many years, we've seen diversity and inclusion practice in the workplace become a dirty word. Right. And I hate that has happened. And we see so many people speaking out and embracing the negative change. Right. And I love that the work you do is exactly the opposite of that. But also love to hear that you're busy, that you have clients, that people are
Thank you.
calling you up to talk about inclusion in the workplace. So let's talk about first business, and then we'll dive into all the other areas. Shakti training, share a bit about your company, and how do you sort of define for other companies how inclusion practices can accelerate growth?
Yeah. So Shakti is a boutique consulting company, me, myself, and I. And I service organizations across different industries. I've been doing this, since I was 25. So I'm 46 now, so quite a bit of time. And the way that I work with organizations is really twofold. One is mainly professional development. So one of the things that I've learned is that so many people, leaders want to be inclusive. They just don't know how, right? So, what are the tools? What are the skills? What are the frameworks to be a more inclusive leader, to cultivate a culture of inclusion and belonging in the workplace? And so I bring that in. I do a lot of lead development. And also, I think one of the reasons that I am really busy is that I don't just do traditional DEI. I do a lot of traditional DEI, so inclusion and belonging and equity and microaggressions and bias and all of that. But I also do intercultural intelligence work. And so, really helping people to understand that our cultures really influence the way that we view the world, the way that we behave, the ways that we approach things like power dynamics and communication. And so, as our workplaces become increasingly globalized and increasingly diverse, that education is really, really needed. I also bring in my communication background, so like conflict management, crisis communication. What do you do when you have a big layoff? How do you prepare your leaders to lay people off and in an inclusive way? And how do you create psychological safety for the survivors of the layoff? So I do that. And then I do a lot of anti-racism work. So really creating a culture of racial inclusion and making sure that people from the global majority can thrive in the workplaces, because our workplaces were really designed for and by white men. So not really inclusive of everyone. So that's one way. And then the other way I partner with organizations is coaching. I do a lot of inclusive leadership coaching, helping leaders to really look at their blind spots and help them to understand what is it that they can do to be a more inclusive leader to better serve their diverse direct reports.
Love that. I mean, that is so I have one experience of working in industry. I've actually talked about it on this podcast where we had training, manager training on inclusive recruiting, right? Because a lot of people don't even get any kind of training, frankly, on inclusion. But then also you go to try to recruit people and your normal biases just, it was anti-bias training. I forgot the title of it, but your natural biases like take effect. So I'd love to hear that you're partnering with companies even beyond recruitment, right? Communications and everything just to build a confidence in leaders, right? Because half of it is many people maybe strive to do it, they try, but your natural bias is going to work against you. And then for those that don't try, you're teaching them something new, right?
And also, it's so important. I think one of the things that is a pet peeve about bias is a lot of people just say, well, this is natural. Let me tell you the science of bias. We have, affinity bias, we have attribution bias. And, because we're human, we have bias. And then that's the end of the conversation. And so a lot of people walk away from those trainings thinking like, well, I have bias and I'm human. But we don't often teach people, well, how do you debias? What are strategies to really disrupt the biases that you have? And that's really important for anyone, right? Not just in the workplace, but to be a better neighbor, I think. So it's applicable to everything. I think inclusion work should be in every corner of our world. So
Absolutely. I mean, if you ever felt different in any way, inclusion work is important, right? And I think that's where many people kind of think it's not necessary in the workplace anymore. But most likely, there are populations of employees in your workplace that have felt different, othered, right? Made to feel kind of lesser than in some circumstance. And that's where you can really offer
yeah,
your leadership team something
yeah.
better.
And
Okay.
when you don't create a culture of inclusion, there's a huge monetary cost. There's also a morale, a cost to the company morale. So, when we don't feel included, we move, and the cost to replace an employee is astronomical. So it costs an organization roughly 15% of a person's salary to replace them. So it's really, really expensive too. So this work is beneficial for everyone, the bottom line and the culture.
Yeah, I love to hear that. That is the point of this podcast, right? Is to help people build better so that they're not only just building better to do it and to do the act of it, but to actually build their business, right? Okay, so you also are a tenured professor in the study of communications and I'm seeing obviously clear ties. So when you're teaching about communication, inclusive communication, right? Those are very important. Like, I'm in customer communication, so I always say, like, how we talk to our customers is also different how we talk than how we talk internally or how we might talk about products. So tell us a little bit about, like, what's the curriculum like? What are you teaching, and how do you build inclusion into that curriculum?
Yeah, so I teach in the Department of Communication Studies and I'm an interculturalist. So a lot of the classes I teach are around intercultural communication. And the reason why actually I went into teaching this is because my own experience as a student learning intercultural communication helped me to understand a lot of the communication and cultural challenges that my family and I experienced as we were, assimilating to the United States as an immigrant family. Also helped me to unlearn a lot of my shame, right? And to help to see like a more global perspective and realize that the world is not just white, right? And white is not right, really. And so I learned that. I felt really empowered by that. My potential was unlocked. And that's why I teach that class. And then I do public speaking, I do organizational communication, and I do a lot of training for faculty and staff around inclusion and belonging and equity and anti-racism. So I would say my career, they really are intertwined. Like my Shakti training really does fit really well into my communication. They're really intertwined with each other. But yeah, I do. I love teaching. I've been doing it for a long time. Education is really different after COVID.
I bet.
Students are really different, but I love helping students to thrive, and I love mentoring them, and I love seeing them succeed. And so it's the most rewarding job in the world.
Love that. And you're building the future business leaders, right?
Yeah,
Like, I think that's the most important thing is when you can teach, when you can start at that early phase of someone's career, you're building those skills for life for
yeah.
them.
And I always tell my students on the last like week of class, like, please connect with me on LinkedIn or Instagram. I want to keep in touch with your life. And, I've been teaching for 22 years. And so I've been connected with students for 22 years. And it's the most amazing thing to see when people really like now I have students that are CEOs. I have students that are like running businesses. And I see it on LinkedIn, and it's just so amazing to know like where they came from, and how they've moved in the trajectory of their career. So I feel proud, even 20 years later. And I just had a student contact me saying, "Hey, I want to do some business with you." So now and then I even get, business referrals. So
Well, yeah, and continuing the cycle and sharing it, like in customer success, we say the best business is referral business, but it's not just the best for you. It's that you actually provided value to somebody. There's confirmed value and they're wanting to continue and pass that value on. And so it sounds like a very similar, kind of thing, right? You've built some people that are advocates that want to also spread the word amongst their companies, which is wonderful.
yeah. Yeah.
They have 16 weeks, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I really am very intentional about building inclusion in the classroom because essentially, you have a class of 25 people, they're there together for 16 weeks. So it's a team, it's a group. And when people don't feel a sense of belonging, they're going to check out, right? And so inclusion is really at the center of what I do. I not only what I teach, but the way that I design my courses, I engage in dialogic lectures, which is really conversation based. We do small group activities. I'm very vulnerable. I share a lot about my life and, when you're vulnerable and these students think like you got it all together, but you let them know like, hey, actually I don't, I'm figuring it out. Let's figure it out together. It empowers them and makes them feel like, oh, if she's struggling in that way, like I can struggle too. So normalizing challenges. I live with depression and anxiety, and I'm very open about that, right? Because, I know that a lot of my students today do. And if you just know the research around Gen Z, in 2009, the level of depression, anxiety, and suicide has doubled to 2019. And a lot of it is because of this, right? The smartphones, the flip cameras, and so I think that vulnerability helps as well. And then just really being inclusive, showing them that I care about them, come to my office hours. If you can't come, let's hop on a call. I'll write you a letter of recommendation. Like, how can I be of service to you and help you move up in your career? And so I really do bring a lot of that. And also with public speaking, if you teach public speaking, you can go in any direction you want, but I always challenge them to use their new skills now and create a platform to speak about what's important to you, right? Advocate for others. And so I would say I bring my DEI lens into everything. I don't force it though, right? Like, what's the cause that you care about? How can you get people bought into this cause? Oratory skills are so important, right? Nobody, if you have power and you know how to speak, I mean, you can move the world. And we're seeing that some ways, negative ways right now, right? Like a lot of the people who are in power right now, they were really successful in persuading people to think a certain way, to vote a certain way. So public speaking didn't start before my students walked in my class, and it will never end. Once they leave, it continues. So I just help them to realize that these are very applicable skills that can really help you to increase your success professionally and personally.
I want to shift a little bit because you talked about your vulnerability. And I want to talk about, when you're going back to kind of the workplace, right? When you're coaching leaders, they have to be vulnerable in order for, truly true inclusion is going to require a bit of vulnerability. And I would love to hear from you. What are some of the barriers that you encounter with leaders and how do you help them overcome those?
I would say the biggest barrier to any inclusive leader is the inability to look in the mirror, right? And, looking in the mirror, not just at your physicality, but your blind spots, your biases, your identities, and how your identity intersects with your privilege and power, and how that might be different from the people in your workplace, the people that you're reporting, right? Because if we're not thinking about, we all experience the workplace differently, right? So I've been doing this long enough that when I go into an organization, if I have a listening session, or even if I don't, I'll talk to like managers. I'm like, this is the best place to work. This is so inclusive. And then you talk to like newer employees or someone like the janitorial staff that has a totally different function and they have a really, really different story. And so if you're not thinking about, well, how does that office admin or the janitorial staff, how are they experiencing this workplace? And what does it have to do with their identities and societal stereotypes and biases that we have? Then I think that is a huge barrier to creating an inclusive workplace and being an inclusive leader. So I think that's the biggest barrier. And also another big barrier is not having humility.
Mm.
And so I work with lots of leaders, and the leaders that have humility are really effective and can change. But if you can't admit that your shit stinks too, sorry if I swore, if that's okay. If you can't admit that, right? We all have our own flaws, and if you just are like, I'm better than you because I am the CEO or I am your senior leader, that's also a huge barrier because in reality, like all of us have gifts, right? All of us bring something to the workplace. And even if we were hired to do a certain job, doesn't mean that we can't grow and excel. And so leaders that don't see that, they're not tapping into the knowledge that they have right in front of them. So I would say those two things.
Yeah, that definitely resonates. I think like thinking it through, I had somebody recently who was a recent guest who was a HR culture leader and she said, hey, we're doing these regular pulse surveys so we understand, but it's a little bit dependent also on who's responding to those pulse surveys. So really understanding if you have a good employee
Yeah.
subset in your data, right?
Yeah.
I want to talk about another area focused on leadership. So, know that diversity has kind of become like a metrics game, right? Like affirmative action was all about numbers and nobody wants this like random numbers game. But there is a financial and there is a numerical benefit to having diverse employee sets. And I mean, I've talked about it on this podcast with other folks too, but I would love to hear from your perspective, like what are some of the areas that differentiate and workplaces that are embracing a little bit more of an inclusive and diverse approach versus those that are not? What are some areas of potential growth? Thinking of somebody that might be starting a business today and how they can kind of better set themselves up for success.
Yeah, I mean, if you are looking at diversity and inclusion, and oftentimes those are like paired together, but they're very different things, right? Diversity is about numerical representation, who's in the room, and organizations are obsessed with diversity metrics, right? Like we're going to have our numbers out. Big tech started that, right? Google and LinkedIn and Apple, they would report numbers, but that doesn't mean anything, right? Having a diverse organization doesn't ensure it's an inclusive one, and oftentimes when we report the diversity metrics, we want to look at who's at the top and who's at the bottom. And usually, the people who are underrepresented are not leading, right? They're not at the top. So when you look at diversity metrics, always kind of look specifically at what roles are represented with diverse populations. But really, I think most organizations miss the mark. And they think, well, we're diverse, we're good, right? Or we just hired a Black leader, or we just hired an Asian woman. they're going to take care of the inclusion. And sometimes we are the ones that are creating toxic workplace environments, because just because you're a person of color, or just because you have a minoritized identity doesn't mean that you're an inclusive leader, right? We all have work to do regardless of our skin color and how we show up. But I think that we are obsessed with metrics. And just for example, women in the workplace, we are 49% of the workplace, 51% of the population, but oftentimes we're still called as minorities, right? And so there has been a big push to increase women, in the workplace, increase leadership. And even though we have very, very populous, demographic, there's a lot of disparities, right? There's a pay gap. The pay gap has only grown in the last 2 years. So it's 84 cents to every man's dollar. 2 years ago, it was 81 cents. And so it's growing. We have a huge leadership gap. So women and men, we start at the workplace at the same level, but we end very differently. Men are about 60% of leaders and women have only 40%. And so I'm just showing you an example of, just because you have representation, it doesn't mean it's inclusive. We have a lot of work to do. Why are women not, in leadership roles? They have to deal with things like bias and microaggressions and, all of these things that societal ideas about what women can do. And so if you work towards inclusion, you're really intentionally cultivating a culture of belonging. And you're thinking about, what can I do intentionally? Is this a business imperative? I think if you're a new business owner and you hope to have people under you, you should look at this as a pillar of your organization, right? And so having a budget, having a committee that works towards this, making sure it's not just a check the box. Like, you don't just bring in someone to speak every year and say, all right, we did our DEI for the year. DEI and inclusion is really embedded within the entire organization. It's not just something that you do over here. And actually, it's also everybody's responsibility, but it starts at the top. So if you're, a leader and you want to see an inclusive workplace, then it has to start with you and your leadership, and then it trickles down. But you see a huge return. I mean, the business case of DEI has been for 30 years, 35 years now, solid, right? And so organizations that are actively working to be inclusive are more innovative, they're more productive, they're more profitable, and they're just overall more successful than their peers that are not actively working on inclusion. So I would just end with saying, like, the big thing is that inclusion is intentional. It just doesn't happen, right? So you have to be intentional.
Yeah, absolutely. You made me think when you said you could hire the diverse leader who's not inclusive. I honestly,
Yeah.
that hadn't crossed my mind. You just make that assumption. Those assumptions are not correct. Even a diverse leader needs training and needs to understand the best practices, right? And so, yeah, that's really like super
And
powerful.
nobody wants to talk about it. I mean, I experienced this a lot as an external consultant. I also experienced it. I've been an employee for 18 years at the same organization. And the first time I had a woman of color that was my VP of education, a Black woman, I was like, oh my God, my life is going to be amazing. And it ended up, I almost quit my job because I had so much trauma from her toxic leadership and the ways that she was treating me. And so I experienced it myself. And what happens is, nobody wants to fire that person, right? Because if you fire a person of color, then it's like, oh, then you're racist. And so it's this cycle that you see a lot. So we have to be very careful to not make that assumption.
That is a lot to unpack. And I think that is more of the reason to invest in like a program and an intentional focus on inclusion, because then you're going beyond just the numbers and the metrics. You mentioned something about that I wanted to like double click on, which is, there are going to be roles and responsibilities that you have not as a leader. And interestingly, so like a couple of years ago, I did a training. It was like how to bring diversity to organization when you're not a hiring manager, right? And I think a lot of times employees feel like they don't have the voice or the space or the platform to be the advocates. What are your recommendations, or what's kind of everybody's responsibility here?
Yeah, well, I mean, one, everyone has a responsibility, right? Inclusion is everyone's responsibility. And if there is nothing happening in your organization and you feel like it's not an inclusive place, be the voice that says, hey, can we have like a DEI committee? Can we have a working group that helps to ensure that we're an inclusive place? I think a lot of people will start with like, let's bring in a speaker, right? But that speaker comes and they have a great talk and everyone's like, oh, I feel good, and pat themselves on the back. And then the next day, they're putting out fires at work and you forget about what you learned. And so having a working committee helps to ensure that there are people that are actively working on inclusion initiatives, working together. Those are the gatekeepers or the catalysts of inclusion that you need, because You can even have, I've seen organizations that have a DEI officer, but one person cannot hold all of this, right? So I would say get employees together, and oftentimes as volunteers. If you have a budget, pay the co-chairs. You have like an official committee to help create programming initiatives. And also the most important part is accountability, right? I'm sure you hear a lot. I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to this that work in an organization have heard their CEOs or their leaders talk about their commitment to inclusion. And so we hear a lot of talk, but are we walking? And so when you don't walk, it's really frustrating. And an inclusion committee can really help hold the leaders accountable and say, hey, this is our mission, but these actions weren't really aligned with what I heard. Can you help me understand? Right. And so when you even question, then those leaders are like, oh, we got to do something about this, right? So I think that's one thing that you can do. And then also just individually, right? One of the beautiful things about being an inclusive person is it doesn't cost any money, right? And having an inclusive organization, you don't need to spend money. So there's some things that you can do. One of the things is if you see bias or discrimination or any kind of oppression, don't just ignore it. Say something, right? So like my motto is if you see something, say something. And I took the Metro train in, Illinois for 13 years before COVID. And that's the Metro train's
Yeah.
slogan, keep us safe. And I think that that slogan can be everywhere. So if you see, someone being racist or sexist or homophobic, or you hear it, or you see a toxic leader and you look away, then you're just perpetuating a toxic workplace, right? And so figure out how you can bring that forward. And I know that nobody wants to get fired, right? So there's this fear of, oh, I don't want to stir the pot. But find ways to share what you're seeing, right? Instead of just ignoring it. And that can help. And then also recognize other people, right? We spent so much of our time in the workplace. We share our talents. We contribute, so much to help these businesses succeed. And when nobody acknowledges our contributions, it stings, right? And so just a small acknowledgement, a thank you note, a Starbucks gift card, maybe it can be an email that goes out acknowledging the employee of the month. Just some kind of recognition of contributions, I think really does help to create that sense of belonging. And then also, you don't have to be a leader to work towards establishing psychological safety. And I don't know if you know what psychological safety is, but it was the concept that was introduced by Amy Edmondson. And it's the idea that we should be able to show up in our teams as we are and admit that we don't know everything and ask for help and be vulnerable and also challenge, right? To be able to challenge and ask questions without being criticized. And when we have psychological safety, then not only are we more productive as a team, but we can help to increase that sense of belonging. So I think that's another thing. And I would say the last thing is get to know what lies beneath the surface, right? We have colleagues at work. We might be work friends, but how much do we know about them? And so, there's so much about me that you can see right now, right? I'm an Indian woman or I'm a woman of color. If I was standing up, you would see that I'm tall. My wedding ring shows that I'm married, but you don't know so much about what you can't see, right? You don't know that I love, music and I love camping and I'm a fitness person. And there's so much that we probably have in common that we wouldn't know unless you get to know what lies beneath the surface. And so that takes intention, asking someone for a coffee, going out to eat, talking to people outside of the workplace. And that really helps us to feel more connected and that increases retention. So all of this goes back to the bottom line as well.
Yeah. Oh, wow. There's just, I mean, that's again, like, I think there's just so much to take from that, right? And it can be something as little as reaching out to someone, getting to know them. That's an act of inclusion, right? And it's funny because I talk about this with children's because I write my children's books and I do like an inclusion talk with children. And it's like funny. I didn't even think of it in the same realm. It's a literally, it can be that easy, right? Sometimes you're in a group and it's asking the person that was quiet about what was their thought, because maybe they're just somebody that's a little bit more introverted and doesn't want to speak out in the group. So really just recognizing and this intentionality can help you to piece all those things together that might just not be in your daily mind.
Yeah. And I want to piggyback on like realizing that there are a lot of introverts and introverts are really about where you get your energy from. It's not if you're talking or not. And, I think that we tend to punish people who have more indirect communication styles and people who are not elaborately speaking, right? But oftentimes the quietest person in the room is the smartest. So
Yeah. No, absolutely. We had that in my business school. orientation, during the first orientation, they said, here's your groups. Make sure that you go around in your meetings and you ask everyone what they think, because likely you are going to have different personalities and different people cooking styles. And I remember the first time we went around the group and asked, and it was like, we solved whatever the complicated economics problem was because one person knew the answer, but they weren't the loudest voice in the room. Right. And it was just so funny. We are like, it really made us all also just take that moment to pause, because it's so easy to go forward in the day to day and get busy, especially in a meeting. I was in a meeting with people I met for the first time yesterday, and I felt awkward chiming in. So I just kept putting my hand up in the Zoom because I was like, at least they'll acknowledge that the hand is up and then I
Yeah.
will speak. But it was like, you have to find those moments.
Yeah, for sure.
I know we're gonna run low on time, so I want to catch up on a couple of other great initiatives that you're a part of. So I had the pleasure of joining the CWLA which is the Chicago Women's Leadership Accelerator this year. I gained so much from it, but the connections, I had like 3 lunches with CWLA people soon after, and it was incredible. So
I love that.
connections for life. But yeah, tell us a little bit about this initiative and like what made you work on it. And I know I'm going to ask you about your other initiative and your other leadership position too. So,
Okay. Well,
just yeah,
yeah,
we'll for it all.
I co-founded the CWLA. It's been 4 years. We're in our 4th year. And the goal is to help close the leadership gap, the long-standing leadership gap between men and women, and to empower women to lead with impact. So that's the goal. And really to help diversify leadership ranks. It's really been a voluntary kind of initiative for the last 3, 4 years. And now we're really growing, and we have a biannual conference, and we're really focused on soft skills, right? Soft skills, which are the new hard skills, because with AI, there's so much that AI can do, but AI cannot teach you how to be inclusive. And so we do inclusive leadership and emotional intelligence as our big learning. And then we have a panel of amazing senior leaders that share their lived experiences and challenges as they were rising up in the ranks. And so there's a lot of awareness created by inspiring women, and our sessions are very interactive, right? And so you get to learn about what are your challenges, right, in your industry. And what we find is that we have so many of the same challenges, even if we have really different jobs, we look really different. And the whole goal is to help others, right? So empowering women to how can you help other women rise as you're rising in your career. So that's a little bit about the CW.
Going back to your core work, you taught women in the room about creating inclusive workplaces, which I love. Like, the tie back is you could make the assumption that you don't need to do that training in that room, right? But you do. And women need to not only advocate for other women, but learn how to advocate for other folks in the workplace and create those inclusive workplaces and, hopefully build the leadership experiences that people want to stay at. So I really loved
Yeah.
that
And I
section.
just want to plug my podcast. We have a podcast.
Yes. Yeah,
It's
yeah,
called
yeah.
Power to Rise, and we highlight the experiences of senior women every month. So you could check it out if you want to be inspired by some really amazing women.
I want to dive into the South Asian Solidarity Movement, correct? So talk a little bit about this leadership initiative that you have that you work on with a couple other folks. Again, I love, first of all, I'm one of those people that's like, when I see multi hyphenate, and I'd like, this word is new, so I just love using it. I don't know if everyone identifies this way, but like people just doing unique things, leaning into the different areas of their skill sets, but also they're just like their passions, right? So tell us a little bit about this organization and what are some of the initiatives in the work that you are doing?
Yeah, so the South Asian Solidarity Movement was founded in 2021. It is a 100% voluntary operation. And, I've been doing work around anti-oppression, justice, inclusion forever. And oftentimes, especially in like the anti-racism spaces, conversations are very black and white. So as a South Asian woman, I always felt kind of like alone, even though I wasn't alone, right? Because our issues being South Asian are really different than, say, maybe some of my Black colleagues, right? We have specific, unique challenges. And so I knew there were other South Asians doing the work, but I would meet them at a conference here and there. And so this is really a container to bring together South Asian people that are justice oriented, that care about disrupting oppression, that want to create a more inclusive world. And we do quarterly engagement. So a lot of our engagements are educational based. We just had really amazing event on cross-racial solidarity. And we had a Black man and an Indigenous man and a Latin woman and an East Asian woman coming together. And I moderated the discussion around what are the challenges? Like, how can we really engage in more proactive and meaningful solidarity? We do things around anti-Blackness and disrupting anti-Blackness, acknowledging our role as South Asians to help really disrupt anti-Blackness, right? Because we have a lot of our opportunities and privileges because of the hundreds of years of, Black Americans fighting for equal rights, right? And so it's a really beautiful thing. We're not just South Asian, so our events are very diverse. We have lots of Black folks, Latin folks, East Asian folks. And it really is just to create a better, more just world. And it's a great community. We have our party. We have a party every year. It's called the Sasam Soiree, happening at Park and Field on August 28th. So you can check us out on Instagram, and we'll be posting there actually this week about that. And that's just a fun party. Every other one we have is very like educational based workshops, interaction. And again, part of what we do is we ask people to look in the mirror, right? What are our biases? What are our blind spots? What are the taboo topics that we were not taught to talk? How can we empower and liberate people who have been told that, they're not okay because they might be, in the LGBTQ community or, whatever it is. So I think it's really important to work on decolonizing our minds and divesting from whiteness and really being on the path of liberation. And I would say that's kind of the goal of SASM.
Yes, that's wonderful. I especially am, I mean, I miss this event, but I love the also cross-cultural event concept, because I think even just opening up space to have those conversations with, to say, here's where we have natural biases, where communities have gone wrong. Let's talk about it and let's try to like actually move forward from it, right? That's really powerful. So excited to hopefully join the next event and be more inspired by the work that you're doing there. So,
It's
yeah.
a great community. Come on in.
Yeah. I know. Well, thank you so much for sharing how to build better from the inside out, right? And the inside out is really the workspace and the culture that you create. And it starts with building an
Yeah.
inclusive workspace. So,
And also because of the anti-DEI sentiment and the legislation, a lot of workplaces and leaders are like, oh no, let me stay away from that
yeah.
because there's this perceived risk. But I'll just end with saying there's also a huge risk when you don't engage and be intentional about creating an inclusive workplace. And that risk is really going to affect your bottom lines.
Yeah, 100%. And so lead with intentionality. And if you don't know the answer of something, go and seek it out, because I think these are the places that, we can start to drive change at a really small,
Yeah.
one step at a time. Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And if you want help, reach out.
and additionally, the CWLA is going to be occurring again in October, you said, correct?
October 15th. Yeah.
October 15th.
Yeah.
So for those Chicago-based people that would like to, or if you happen to be in Chicago around that time, we'll drop the link for that as well. And South Asian Solidarity Movement as well. So
Thank you.
thank you so much, Cindu, for being here today.
It was great to see you again.
Yes, same here. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for another episode of South Asian Success. Hope that you enjoyed this as much as I did, and hope to see you at the next episode. Take care. Thanks for listening to The Business of Success. If today's conversation sparked a new way of thinking about growth, value, talent, leadership, don't forget to follow along and share this episode with someone who is building something meaningful. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Customer X Success, which is helping organizations design customer value, build better and higher impact teams, and turn success into a growth strategy. You can learn more about Customer X Success at www.customerxsuccess.com. I'm Parul Bandari, and this is The Business of Success, where success is built, not just chased. Until next time, see you soon.